The Delta flight from Atlanta to Seattle had been airborne for exactly 37 minutes when the first SEAL moved into position. Row 6, Seat C. The woman sleeping there had graying temples beneath a worn baseball cap. Her breathing steady and controlled even in rest. She'd chosen the aisle seat deliberately, old habits from a lifetime of needing quick exits. The SEALs knew this. They knew everything about her. Commander David Carter stood frozen in the aisle, his hand halfway to his earpiece, staring at the small pin on her jacket collar. The other passengers hadn't noticed the four men converging on her position, hadn't registered the subtle hand signals, or the way they'd systematically blocked every escape route, but Carter knew that she had. Even asleep, Sarah Hawk Mitchell was aware of every movement around her. The pin was unmistakable, a silver raven clutching lightning bolts, worn smooth from years of unconscious touching. Only 12 people in the history of American military aviation had earned that insignia. Carter's throat went dry. The intelligence briefing had mentioned a former pilot would be on board, someone who might assist if things went sideways with their classified cargo in the hold. They hadn't mentioned it would be her. Mitchell's eyes opened slowly, focusing immediately on Carter's chest, where his concealed sidearm created an imperceptible bulge beneath his civilian clothes. She didn't move, didn't even shift her breathing pattern. "Whatever's in the cargo hold," she said quietly, her Polish accent barely detectable after 40 years stateside. "You've got about 6 minutes before it becomes everyone's problem." Carter's blood chilled. The electromagnetic pulse device they were secretly transporting wasn't supposed to arm itself for another 2 hours. How could she possibly? "The plane's trimming wrong," Mitchell interrupted, finally sitting up. Her weathered hands, scarred from old burns, moved to unbuckle her seat belt with practiced efficiency. Subtle pitch oscillations every 90 seconds. "Your package is interfering with the fly-by-wire system." She stood barely 5 feet 4 inches, forcing Carter to step back. "I'm guessing none of you boys are rated for a Boeing 737-900ER. The other SEALs exchanged glances. Their mission parameters hadn't included this contingency. Mitchell moved past them toward the cockpit, her gait slightly uneven, an old injury they hadn't known about. "Ma'am," Carter started, "you can't." She turned, and for the first time in his decorated career, Carter understood why enemy pilots had named her Hawk. It wasn't about death. It was about inevitability. "Son, I've landed F-16s with half a wing missing and brought home crews that everyone else wrote off. You can either arrest a 63-year-old grandmother or you can let me save everyone on this plane." She paused at the cockpit door, including whatever asset they were protecting down below. The choice hung in the air like a challenge while the aircraft's barely perceptible tremor grew worse. 10 years earlier, Mitchell had stood in a Pentagon briefing room watching senior officers dismiss her tactical assessments with polite condescension. They saw the gray hair, the slight frame, the quiet demeanor, and assumed she was past her prime. They hadn't bothered to read her full service record, the classified parts that detailed operations over Kosovo, Iraq, and places that still didn't officially exist. The same dismissiveness that had forced her into early retirement now flickered across Carter's face, warring with his recognition of that pin. "For minutes," she said, checking her watch, a battered Omega Speedmaster that had seen 5 combat zones. "The EMP's magnetic field is creating a feedback loop with the avionics. When it reaches critical resonance, this plane becomes a very expensive glider." She pulled out her phone, showing him an app displaying electromagnetic readings. "I've been tracking it since boarding." Carter's earpiece crackled. "Alpha lead. Cargo temperature rising. Containment looks compromised." Mitchell heard it too, her hearing still sharp despite years of jet engines. "Thermal runaway. Your cooling system's failing." She moved toward the cockpit door again. "I need access to the flight deck now." "That's not possible," Carter said automatically, even as sweat beaded on his forehead. "Federal regulations." "Federal regulations don't account for experimental weapons achieving spontaneous criticality at 37,000 feet, Mitchell shot back. She pulled out a leather wallet worn soft with age and flipped it open. The ID was 15 years old, but the authorization code at the bottom was still valid. She'd maintained it through channels most people didn't know existed. Project Blackbird emergency protocols. Check with whoever's running your operation. Carter hesitated, then activated his throat mic control. This is Alpha Lead. We have a situation. Passenger identifies as Sarah Mitchell, claiming Blackbird authority. The silence stretched for 10 seconds before a different voice came through, older, with unmistakable authority. Carter, that's Hawk. Give her whatever she wants. The SEAL team's dynamic shifted instantly. These were men who'd operated in the world's most dangerous places, who'd faced down terrorists and warlords. But the reverence in their commander's voice made them reassess the small woman in front of them. Carter handed her his earpiece. General Hayes, Mitchell said, recognizing the voice. Been a while. Hawk, what the hell are you doing on that flight? Visiting my granddaughter in Seattle. Lucky for you, I was already moving. Carter cleared a path. Your boys brought an unstable M device onto a commercial flight. The containment's failing. I need cockpit access and someone to get me eyes on the package. Do it, Hayes ordered. Carter, you're under Colonel Mitchell's command now. Carter glanced at her civilian clothes. Retired? Retired, Mitchell corrected, though her bearing had shifted subtly, carrying an authority that made the distinction irrelevant. She knocked on the cockpit door in a specific pattern. 324 Federal Air Marshal Protocol. The door opened immediately. The pilots turned, confused at the small crowd behind them. Gentlemen, we have a situation, Mitchell said, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had delivered worse news under worse conditions. I need you to begin descent immediately. Maximum rate without alarming passengers. She moved to the center console, eyes scanning the instruments with practiced efficiency. Your artificial horizon's already showing micro-oscillations. See it. Captain Mark Thompson, 25 years of commercial flying, leaned forward. I thought that was turbulence. No turbulence at this altitude with these weather conditions, Mitchell replied, pulling up the weather radar. Clear skies for 300 miles. That shimmer's electromagnetic interference. She turned to Carter. How big is the device? Classified, he started, then caught her look. Briefcase-sized. 20 kilos. Power source, radioisotope thermoelectric generator. Mitchell's expression tightened. You brought nuclear material onto a commercial flight. It was supposed to be inert during transport, Carter defended. The containment failed because someone didn't account for interaction with the aircraft's radar altimeter, Mitchell finished. It's creating a resonance cascade. The RTG's heat is accelerating the process. She turned back to the pilots. Gentlemen, in about 90 seconds your fly-by-wire system's going to start giving you false readings. You need to switch to manual backup now while you still trust your instruments. Thompson hesitated. Ma'am, with respect, who are you? Mitchell pulled off her baseball cap, revealing silver hair pulled back in a tight bun and a scar that ran from her left temple to her ear. Shrapnel from an engagement nobody talked about. Someone who's landed planes in worse conditions than what's coming. She looked at Carter. I need 2 of your men in the cargo hold. The device needs to be moved to the rear pressure bulkhead, furthest point from the avionics bay. Carter nodded, detailing 2 SEALs with hand signals. They moved out silently. Captain Thompson, Mitchell continued, you served Navy F-18s. Good. You remember unusual attitude recovery? Haven't practiced in 15 years. You're about to. She pointed to the altitude indicator. The artificial horizon was now showing a definite wobble. When the instruments go, you'll have about 30 seconds of confusion before your inner ear adjusts. Trust your physical senses, not the gauges. She pulled out her phone again, opening an app. I'm uploading GPS coordinates to your backup navigation. There's a military airfield 40 miles north. Runway's long enough, and they'll be expecting us. How? Carter started. I called them while you were debating whether to trust me, Mitchell replied. Old friends. They're clearing airspace now. Her phone buzzed. That's your men. Package is relocated but heating up. We've bought ourselves maybe 10 minutes. The plane suddenly lurched. A subtle shift that passengers would attribute to turbulence, but Mitchell recognized as the first stage of system failure. The primary flight display flickered, numbers jumping erratically before stabilizing. Now, Captain, Mitchell said calmly. Initiate descent, 3,000 feet per minute. Tell passengers we're avoiding weather. Thompson switched to manual control, his hands steady on the yoke despite the sweat on his forehead. The co-pilot was already on the intercom, his voice professionally calm as he delivered the cover story. Mitchell watched the instruments, her mind calculating variables with the same precision that had kept her alive through 30 years of military aviation. Carter, your device, is it prototype or production? Prototype. First field test. Who designed it? Classified. She turned, fixing him with a stare that had made generals reconsider their orders. Someone who didn't understand electromagnetic propagation in pressurized environments. Was it synthesis defense systems? Carter's surprise was answer enough. Thought so. They bid on a project I consulted for in '09. Same flawed resonance calculations. She turned back to the instruments. Captain, reduce speed to 220 knots. We need to minimize vibration. The altitude indicator showed them passing through 28,000 feet. Outside, the clear morning sky gave no hint of the crisis unfolding. Passengers continued reading, sleeping, unaware that their lives hung on the decisions being made in the cockpit. Carter's earpiece crackled. He'd given her his primary while he used the backup. Package temperature critical. Emission levels spiking. Mitchell closed her eyes, visualizing the aircraft systems, the electromagnetic fields, the interference patterns. It was like seeing music, understanding the harmonics that others couldn't perceive. Tell them to wrap it in emergency blankets, the metallic ones from the medical kit. Create a Faraday cage. Won't stop it, but might buy us minutes. She opened her eyes to find Thompson staring at her. You're the one who saved Flight 447 over the Atlantic. That's classified, Mitchell replied automatically. My brother was on that flight. She nodded once, acknowledgement without elaboration. That operation had cost her officially. She'd never been there, but the family she'd saved knew different. Thompson's renewed focus on the controls carried a different energy now, personal investment beyond professional duty. The plane lurched again, harder this time. Warning lights cascaded across the panel. Hydraulic pressure, electrical bus failure, a dozen systems crying out in digital distress. The artificial horizon spun wildly before going dark. All passengers remained seated with seat belts fastened, the co-pilot announced, his voice steady despite the chaos in the cockpit. We're experiencing minor technical difficulties. Mitchell laughed short and sharp. Minor. She pulled a worn notebook from her jacket, analog backup for digital failure. Captain, your backup altimeter is mechanical. Trusted. Current reading, 21,500. She calculated quickly, pencil flying across paper. 11 minutes till landing at current descent rate. Carter, tell control we need emergency vehicles standing by. Full hazmat protocols. Already done. Hayes's voice came through the earpiece. Hawk, can you bring them home? Have I ever left anyone behind, Robert? No, but you've never been retired before either. Retirement's boring, Mitchell replied, noting the hydraulic pressure dropping. Captain, you're about to lose power steering. It'll feel like wrestling a bear, but the cables are intact. You'll have manual control. Thompson's knuckles whitened on the yoke as the hydraulic assist failed. The 737 suddenly felt its full weight, every control input requiring physical force. His co-pilot joined him, both men pulling together. Good, Mitchell encouraged. Remember, she wants to fly. You're just guiding her home. She checked her watch. Carter, status on the package. Contained, but building pressure. The blankets are helping, but... An explosion of static cut him off. The lights in the cabin flickered and died. Emergency lighting kicked in, casting everything in an eerie amber glow. Screams erupted from the passenger compartment, quickly suppressed by flight attendants trained for crisis. EMP pulse, Mitchell announced unnecessarily. Partial discharge. Main electronics are gone. She pulled out a compass, an actual magnetic compass she'd carried for 40 years. Heading 270. The airfield's at 285 magnetic, 15 degrees right. Captain Mark Thompson and his co-pilot struggled with the dead controls, the plane beginning to list left as asymmetric drag took hold. Without the computers to compensate, every imperfection in the aircraft's trim became a fight against physics. "Colonel, we're losing altitude too fast," the co-pilot reported, voice strained. 3,800 feet per minute. Mitchell moved between them, her small frame somehow commanding the space. "Deploy speed brakes to 60%. It'll reduce your descent rate, but increase drag. You'll need more power to maintain airspeed." She watched Thompson's hands. "That's it. Feel the aircraft. She's talking to you." Through the cockpit windows, the ground was visible now, brown earth and scattered clouds below. The military airfield should be visible soon, if they were on course, if the calculations were right, if a dozen other variables aligned. There, the co-pilot pointed, a runway impossibly distant but unmistakably real. Emergency vehicles lined its length, lights flashing in anticipation. 12 miles, Mitchell calculated instantly. Altitude 15,000. Too high, Captain. Full speed brakes. We need to dump altitude without gaining too much velocity. She turned to Carter, who'd appeared in the doorway. "The package, stable for now. The Faraday cage is holding, but the heat. We'll breach in about 3 minutes, Mitchell finished. Which is why we're landing in 2. Thompson looked at her, sweat streaming down his face. "That's impossible. We need at least..." "Captain Thompson." Mitchell's voice cut through his protest with surgical precision. "I've landed an F-16 on a carrier deck in a typhoon. I've put a C-130 down on a dirt road in Afghanistan under fire. This is a luxury." She pointed to the runway, now clearly visible. "Gear down at 8,000, full flaps at 5. You're going to come in hot and high, but that runway's 14,000 feet of reinforced concrete. You could land the space shuttle on it." "Gear's hydraulic," the co-pilot protested. "Without power. Manual release." Mitchell was already moving, pulling open an access panel. "Haven't done this since flight school, have you?" She yanked the release handles in sequence. The landing gear dropped with a thunderous bang that sent new screams through the passenger cabin. 7,000, Thompson announced, his voice steady despite everything. "Flaps," Mitchell ordered. The co-pilot pulled the manual releases, the aircraft shuddering as control surfaces deployed asymmetrically. "Easy. Let her find her balance." Through it all, Carter watched with a mixture of awe and disbelief. His team had extracted diplomats under fire, had performed operations that would never be acknowledged. But this, watching a 63-year-old woman orchestrate an impossible landing through sheer force of will and decades of experience, this was something else entirely. 5,000, speed 240 knots. Too fast. "It's fine," Mitchell assured them. "You've got runway to spare. Carter, tell your men to brace the package. When we hit, it's going to shift." The ground rushed up, details resolving into buildings, vehicles, people. The runway loomed, a ribbon of salvation in a situation that should have been catastrophic. 1,000, the co-pilot called. 5,200. The 737 slammed into the concrete with a bone-jarring impact that would have failed any check ride, but the gear held, the structure intact despite the violence of the landing. Thompson and his co-pilot stood on the brakes, manual pressure only, fighting to keep the aircraft centered as it screamed down the runway. "Reverse thrust." Mitchell shouted. Manual deployment. The co-pilot pulled the levers, the engines roaring in protest as they fought to slow 200,000 pounds of aircraft and human lives. The end of the runway approached at terrifying speed, the overrun area beyond it barely visible in the morning haze. They stopped with 300 feet to spare. For a moment, nobody moved. Then the passenger cabin erupted in cheers, the sound carrying through the reinforced cockpit door. Thompson slumped in his seat, hands shaking as adrenaline crashed through his system. "Not bad, Captain," Mitchell said mildly. "Bit rough on the approach, but you'll do better next time." He stared at her, then laughed, a release of tension that bordered on hysteria. "Next time." Carter's earpiece crackled urgently. "The package is breaching. Everyone out, now." Mitchell was already moving, grabbing the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is an emergency evacuation. Leave all belongings and exit immediately through the emergency slides." She turned to Thompson. "Deploy all slides. Get everyone at least 500 meters from the aircraft." The evacuation was chaos. Controlled chaos, but chaos nonetheless. Flight attendants who moments before had been serving drinks now became shepherds of survival, guiding passengers down inflatable slides into the arms of waiting military personnel. Mitchell stood at the cockpit door, counting heads, memorizing faces, ensuring no one was left behind. "That's everyone," Carter reported. "Except your men are still in the cargo hold," Mitchell finished. She was already moving toward the lower deck access with the package. "Colonel, no," but she was gone. Her slight frame disappearing down the maintenance ladder into the belly of the aircraft. Carter followed, cursing, his SEAL training warring with his instinct to protect someone who clearly didn't need protecting. The cargo hold was a furnace, heat radiating from the innocent-looking briefcase wrapped in emergency blankets. Two SEALs stood guard, their faces grim with understanding of what staying meant. "Out now," Mitchell ordered. "The package is going critical in about 30 seconds, she interrupted, already moving toward it. "Unless someone adjusts the containment field manually." She pulled out a multi-tool. Its metal was warm to the touch, which required someone who understood the resonance patterns. "Colonel," Carter started. "Take your men and go," Mitchell said calmly, prying open the briefcase's access panel. Inside, circuits sparked and writhed, the electromagnetic field visible as a shimmer in the air. "That's an order." Carter hesitated, torn between duty and something deeper. Respect, perhaps, or recognition of a sacrifice being made. "How long do you need?" 40 seconds to stabilize. Another minute to safe it. She didn't look up, her hands steady as she worked despite the heat that was already blistering her skin. "You have 20 seconds to clear the blast radius." The SEALs moved, training overcoming emotion. Carter was the last to leave, pausing at the ladder. "Your granddaughter knows I love her," Mitchell finished. "Go." Alone in the cargo hold, Mitchell worked with the precision of a surgeon and the speed of a combat pilot. The device was elegant in its lethality, a masterpiece of destruction that someone had built without understanding the forces they were playing with. She could see the flaw now, the harmonic frequency that would tear the electromagnetic field apart and release enough energy to vaporize the aircraft and everything within a quarter mile. Her fingers flew across the circuits, redirecting power, creating new pathways for the energy to dissipate. The heat was overwhelming now, her vision blurring from more than just sweat. The scar on her temple throbbed, a reminder of another impossible situation, another moment when everyone said she couldn't do what needed to be done. The field strength peaked, the air itself seeming to bend around the device. For a heartbeat, Mitchell thought she'd miscalculated, that 40 years of experience had finally failed her. Then the resonance broke, the frequency dropping to a manageable level as her modifications took hold. She sat back, breathing hard, her hands burned and shaking. The device hummed quietly now, contained, safe. Through the cargo hold windows, she could see emergency vehicles surrounding the aircraft, personnel in hazmat suits preparing to approach. Carter found her there 5 minutes later, still sitting beside the device, her burned hands cradled in her lap. "Medics are coming," he said quietly. It's stable, she replied, her voice low. Tell Synthesis Defense their math is wrong. Equation 17 needs a correction factor for pressurized environments. He helped her to her feet, noting how she favored her left leg more than before. That pin, he said, gesturing to the Raven insignia. Project Blackbird. I thought that was just a legend. Lots of things are legends, Mitchell replied. Doesn't mean they're not true. As they emerged from the aircraft, the assembled military personnel straightened to attention. Someone had spread the word, who she was, what she'd done, not just today, but across decades of service that most of them could only imagine. Even the hazmat teams paused in their approach, acknowledging something that transcended rank or protocol. General Robert Hayes stood beside the mobile command unit, his weathered face showing a mixture of relief and something deeper. They'd served together when they were both young and foolish enough to think they were invincible. Now gray-haired and scarred, they understood the weight of survival. Sarah, he said simply. Robert, she accepted the blanket someone wrapped around her shoulders, wincing as it touched her burned hands. Your boys did good. Carter especially. Carter started to protest that he'd done nothing, but Hayes silenced him with a look. Debrief in an hour. Get her to medical first. I'm fine, Mitchell said automatically. That's an order, Colonel. She smiled slightly. Still pulling rank after all these years. Someone has to keep you from killing yourself for the greater good. The medics led her to an ambulance, Carter trailing behind. As they treated her burns, he finally asked the question that had been burning in him since he'd seen the pin. Why Hawk? Mitchell was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. Then, staring at her bandaged hands, she spoke. First combat mission, Kosovo, 1999. Lost my wingman to a SAM. Spent the next 6 hours alone in enemy airspace completing his mission and mine. Command thought I was dead until I landed with half my fuel gone and 37 bullet holes in my aircraft. She looked up at him. The Serbian pilots who survived started calling me Hawk. Not because I brought death, but because I always came back no matter what. And your wingman? Second Lieutenant Thomas Mitchell, my husband. Her voice was steady, matter of fact. Been flying solo ever since. Carter absorbed this, understanding now the weight she carried, the reason she never left anyone behind. Your granddaughter, he ventured. She knows what you did today. She knows I was visiting, Mitchell replied. That's enough. Let her think Grandma spent the flight reading her book and complaining about the peanuts. A commotion outside drew their attention. Through the ambulance windows, they could see passengers being interviewed by security personnel, their voices carrying on the wind. Someone was describing the emergency landing, how the pilots had saved them all. No mention of the small woman who'd orchestrated their survival from the shadows. That's how it should be, Mitchell said, catching Carter's look. Thompson and his co-pilot did the flying. They deserve the credit. But you did what needed doing. He watched her flex her bandaged fingers experimentally. Same as always. Hayes appeared in the ambulance doorway, a tablet in his hand. Synthesis Defense is screaming about their prototype. Want to know how a passenger compromised their classified project? Tell them to hire better physicists, Mitchell replied. Or at least ones who understand resonance propagation. I told them you'd consult on the redesign. I'm retired. You were retired an hour ago, too. Hayes's expression softened. Sarah, we need you. Not for the flying anymore, but for this, catching the things others miss, seeing the patterns that'll get people killed. Mitchell was quiet, thinking of her small apartment in Atlanta, the garden she'd been tending, the peaceful life she'd built after decades of war. Then she thought of the passengers on that plane, alive because she'd been in the right place at the right time with the right knowledge. Part-time, she said finally, consulting only. And I want Carter on my team. Carter straightened, surprised. Ma'am? You listened, she explained. When it mattered, you put aside ego and listened. That's rarer than you'd think. She turned to Hayes. He's got good instincts. Just needs someone to teach him to see beyond the obvious. Hayes nodded. Done. We'll set you up with an office at Peterson. Close enough to visit your granddaughter, far enough from DC politics. And the device is being secured as we speak. Your modification's held, the tech team's calling it miraculous. It's not miraculous, Mitchell corrected. It's physics, understanding forces, and how they interact. Same as flying. You don't fight the air, you work with it. She stood steadier now, despite the pain medication beginning to work. Through the ambulance window, she could see the 737 sitting on the runway, emergency slides still deployed like yellow tongues. In a few hours, it would be swarming with investigators, everyone trying to understand how a classified weapon had nearly brought down a commercial flight. But for now, it was quiet, just another aircraft on a military runway carrying the secret of what had almost happened and the woman who'd prevented it. I need to make a call, Mitchell said. My granddaughter's expecting me for dinner. Hayes handed her his phone. As she dialed, Carter asked, "What will you tell her?" "That my flight was delayed," Mitchell replied. "That I'll be a few hours late, but I'll bring dessert from her favorite bakery." She paused as the phone rang. The truth, just not all of it. Her granddaughter answered on the third ring, voice bright with excitement about showing Grandma her science project. Something about electromagnetic fields. Ironically enough, Mitchell listened, making appropriate sounds of interest, her voice giving no hint of the burns on her hands or the crisis she had just navigated. When she hung up, Carter was staring at her with something approaching awe. "How do you do that? Compartmentalize like that?" "Practice," Mitchell replied. 40 years of practice. She looked at the 737 again. "Every mission ends, Commander. The skill is knowing when to let it go and when to hold on. And this one I hold on to just long enough to make sure synthesis defense doesn't kill anyone else with their incompetence." Her expression hardened slightly. "Then I let it go and have dinner with my granddaughter." The afternoon sun was climbing higher, burning off the morning haze. Around them, the controlled chaos of the emergency response was settling into routine, investigators arriving, evidence being catalogued, statements being taken. The passengers were being loaded onto buses, heading for a nearby hotel where they'd wait for alternative flights. Most were on their phones, telling loved ones about their brush with disaster, not knowing how close they'd actually come. Captain Mark Thompson appeared, still in his sweat-stained uniform. He stopped when he saw Mitchell, something passing between them that didn't need words. "Thank you," he said simply. "You did the flying," she replied. "We both know that's not true." He pulled something from his pocket, a pair of wings, the kind pilots gave to kids who visited the cockpit. "My brother sends these to his children, tells them about the angel who saved his flight over the Atlantic." He pressed them into her bandaged hand. "Now I've got my own story." After he left, Carter found himself studying Mitchell with new eyes. The unassuming grandmother who'd boarded in row 6 was gone, replaced by someone who carried history in her scars and wisdom in her silence. "The pin," he said, gesturing to the Raven insignia. "How many operations?" "Classified," she replied automatically, then softened enough to add, "The real victories are the ones nobody ever hears about." A text chimed on Hayes's tablet. He read it, his expression darkening. "Synthesis Defense wants a full debrief. They're claiming the device performed as designed, that any failure was user error." Mitchell laughed, sharp and bitter. "User error, right?" She stood, steadying herself against the ambulance wall. "Set up the meeting. I'll need their design specifications, test data, and whoever signed off on the field trial." "Sarah, you don't have to." 237 people, she interrupted. "That's how many were on that plane, plus crew, plus whoever was in the blast radius if it had detonated." Her gray eyes were still. "So yes, Robert, I do have to." Carter watched the transformation, the grandmother disappearing entirely, replaced by the officer who'd flown into hell and back. This was Hawk, the legend who'd become myth. Myth who'd become real again in the crisis of the morning. "What do you need?" he asked. She looked at him appraisingly. "A secure workspace, coffee that doesn't taste like jet fuel, and someone who can explain to synthesis defense that electromagnetic resonance isn't a suggestion. It's a law of physics." "I can handle the first two," Hayes said. "The third might require divine intervention." "Then it's good I'm feeling religious today," Mitchell replied. "Nothing like almost dying to make you appreciate the finer points of survival." As they walked toward the command unit, Carter fell into step beside her. "Colonel, can I ask you something? Why were you really on that flight? You don't strike me as someone who does anything by coincidence." She smiled slightly. "Sometimes, Commander, coincidence is just the universe putting you where you need to be. The trick is recognizing when you're there." The command unit was a hive of activity, screens showing satellite feeds, radar tracks, and technical readouts of the device's electromagnetic signature. Technicians looked up as they entered, recognition flickering across faces as they realized who she was. "Attention on deck," someone called, but Mitchell waved them down. "As you were, we've got work to do." She moved to the central display, eyes taking in the data with practiced efficiency. "This is wrong," she said immediately, pointing to a frequency reading. And good God, did anyone at Synthesis actually test this thing?" A young technician, barely out of college by the look of him, ventured, "Ma'am, the simulation showed." "Simulations assume perfect conditions," Mitchell interrupted, not unkindly. "Real world doesn't give you perfect. Real world gives you a pressurized aluminum tube at 37,000 feet with 300 souls depending on you to see what the computers missed." She turned to the display, pulling up the device's specifications. "Look here." They calculated for sea-level atmospheric pressure. Nobody accounted for the pressure differential at altitude. The containment field was designed for 14.7 SI, but at cruising altitude, you're dealing with 4.3. That variance created the resonance cascade. The room was silent, everyone absorbing the implications. Carter spoke first. "So it was never going to work as designed?" "Oh, it would work fine," Mitchell replied. "On the ground in a controlled environment. But the moment you took it airborne," she shrugged. "Physics doesn't care about your design intentions." Hayes's phone rang. He listened, his expression grim. "Synthesis CEO's on his way. Wants to speak with whoever compromised their prototype." "Compromised?" Mitchell's voice was dangerously quiet. "I stabilized their prototype. There's a difference." An hour later, the conference room was tense with barely contained animosity. William Bill Anderson, Synthesis Defense Systems CEO, sat across from Mitchell, his legal team flanking him like bodyguards. He was everything she'd expected: expensive suit, calculated arrogance.